Flattened Incredible photos show 5 mansions worth £1 million each demolished after being built in breach of planning regulations. Astonishing photos show the demolition of 5 mansions worth £1 million each after they were built too big, leaving homeowners devastated. The almost complete 6-bed properties were found to be up to a third bigger and in different locations than allowed under planning rules. Their plot is now little more than a pile of rubble after the final home was razed to the ground this week. Councillors ordered the demolitions on the West Pennine Moors near Bolton, Lancs, in 2018. But legal wrangling with developer Sparkle Developments and pleas from homeowners meant the work to take them down did not start until May last year. An inquiry heard how Plot 1 had a 31% bigger footprint than allowed, while Plot 2 was 19% bigger, Plot 3 32% bigger, and Plot 4 33% bigger. The developer had claimed the enforcement notice issued by the council to demolish the homes was excessive and too harsh to remedy any breach in planning regulations. And Elon Raja, who owns one of the mansions, told the hearing he'd faced a nightmare as he begged for his house to be left standing. He said he paid £1,057,000 for the plot in 2016, but has since spent more than £215,000 on the rental of an alternative property and other costs. "It has had life-changing consequences for me," he said. "I feel trapped in a vicious circle with deepening financial pressures and effects on my family. Every day feels like I'm waking up to a nightmare. The best way to describe it is a pressure cooker." In spite of his pleas, the properties have now been torn down. Councillor Andy Morgan said, "It's the right thing to do. There are 2 applications for individual plots to be built with slight alterations. The intent is to rebuild them and save much of the materials." What to know about planning permission? While minor improvements to your home may not need planning permission, any major works will need the council's go-ahead. You'll need planning permission if you're going to build a new property, make a major change to your existing home, or change the use of a building. To find out if you need permission, contact your local council. You can also search a register of planning decisions to object or comment on proposed works in your area. After you apply, your local authority will decide whether to grant permission. It will take into account factors such as the number, size, and appearance of the buildings, and how your development would affect the surrounding area. You'll usually find out the council's decision within 8 weeks. If you're not granted permission, you might be able to appeal. If you carry out works that require permission without getting it, you can be served an enforcement notice, which will order you to undo all the changes you've made. You can appeal an enforcement notice, but it's illegal to ignore it.
Our coverage of the war in Ukraine will continue, of course, but we need to update you on the breaking news in the past few hours we've had from China, where a passenger jet has crashed. The China Eastern plane was on an internal flight when it came down in remote countryside near the city of Wuzhou. Here's what we know about China Eastern flight MU5735. It took off at 0516 GMT, that's just after 1:15 in the afternoon local time, from the city of Kunming. There were 132 crew and passengers on board. Its destination was Guangzhou, a trip which usually takes just under an hour and 40 minutes. Flight tracking details suggest everything was fine until around 0620 GMT, just over an hour into the flight. The aircraft then begins a sudden, unexplained descent. In just 1 minute, it lost 6,000 feet in altitude. That's an average vertical speed of around 110 kilometers per hour. It's possible it was accelerating downwards in that time. Let's bring in our correspondent Theo Leggett, who is with me now and has been looking into this crash. Just tell us more, Theo, about what we know about that vertical descent and how unusual.
Well, until the last 2.5 minutes of this flight, it was a perfectly normal flight. It took off, it got to a cruising altitude. It was less than an hour from its destination, I believe. And then it started descending very rapidly. In fact, looking at the figures from sites like Flight Radar 24, it appears it was descending at about 10,000 feet per minute. So this is well beyond what you would see in the event of an emergency descent, for example. So something went rapidly wrong. We don't know what. It impacted a mountainside and everybody aboard was killed. Now, it's important to note a few things here. First of all, The aircraft concerned was a Boeing 737-800. That's one of the next generation series of Boeing 737. So it was first produced in the mid-90s. There were some 7,000 overall have been produced, 5,000 of them of this variant, and they, generally speaking, have a very, very good safety record. So we're in a different situation to where we were, for example, 3 years ago with ET-302 that went down over Ethiopia, or the Indonesian plane that went down a few months beforehand. Those were 737 MAX aircraft. They were a new model with new software that later turned out to be faulty. This is different. It's a well-established, well-tried and tested aircraft. And the one involved in the accident wasn't even that old. It was only about six years old.
So what is the speculation now about what happened? Could it potentially have been structural?
It could potentially have been a number of things, and that's where it's important to let the investigators get on with their work, because there are lots of different options. So, for example, it could be deliberate. There could be some kind of terrorism act or something to do with one of the pilots. Or it could be an in-flight structural failure. Or it could be a collision, say, with another smaller aircraft or an unmanned aerial vehicle. All of these things are possibilities. What investigators will be doing is studying the scene of the accident, studying the background to the flight, all the documentation that comes with it, and eventually trying to find the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. Those are essential items because they'll say what was going on in the cockpit, not just what the pilots were saying, but the sounds, the alarms that they were facing. And the flight data recorder will have all sorts of parameters about the state of the aircraft and what it was doing in the moments leading up to the crash.
Theo, we're just seeing the very first pictures that we have in from the site, and that is a huge amount of rescuers heading to the scene. Is there any other video around or any other eyewitness accounts that are circulating that could sort of help us understand what happened?
Well, there's a lot circulating on social media, and there's one video in particular which people are passing around which appears to show an aircraft descending very, very rapidly into a wooded mountainside. But it's also worth bearing in mind that in events like this you often get false videos being put out. Some people have an agenda. So all of these things have to be treated with a certain amount of skepticism, I think.
And do Chinese airlines generally have quite a good safety record?
Yes, they do. And China Eastern certainly has a perfectly good safety record. I think the last fatal accident it was involved in was some 12 years ago. So this is not a situation where you've got an airline with a poor safety record. It's not an aircraft that is a new design or anything like that. It's a tried and tested aircraft flown by an airline with a good reputation.
And air safety and aviation standards in general just continually improve, presumably, at the moment, because there's more transparency around the sector. Would that be fair to say?
Well, safety standards in aviation are very high. They have been very high for a long time. Statistically speaking, it's one of the safest forms of travel because airlines won't fly people unless they're confident, and people need the confidence of knowing that the airlines are safe.
Theo, thanks for that. We're going to bring in Steve McDonough, our correspondent who joins us now from Beijing. Steve, what is the latest that we're hearing from the scene of the crash?
Well, fire workers, like fire teams who raced there to try to see if there's anyone to be found, are saying that there's no sign of survivors. We're also hearing from rescue teams that the plane has disintegrated completely and that when it hit the ground, it set fire to a bamboo forest. So it looks like there's nothing much left of the plane by the time it hit. On the evening news, which has just gone out here, it started with the presenter delivering a message from Xi Jinping calling for a quick investigation to try and find out what's gone wrong, to see if, potentially they need to ground every single Boeing 737-800 jet in the country. Li Keqiang, the number 2 leader here, also is said to have called for a very timely, in his words, timely and frank investigation. So they're trying to, at least publicly, say they want the truth here. They want to know if there's any chance this could happen again.
Steve, thanks so much for that update. The news on that Chinese passenger plane that has crashed with 132 people on board. It's thought there were no survivors.